The widow gave him her last meal, then discovered his secret. Some stories don't begin with riches, power, or glory. They begin in silence, the kind that settles in a house too empty to echo. The walls of the widow's home whispered tales of hunger. Her kitchen held nothing but shadows, and her heart carried the weight of despair. It was not the first night she had gone to bed without food, but this night felt heavier, more final, as though tomorrow might never come. Hey, stick with me till the very end. You won't believe what happened next, and I promise it's worth every second. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. The cupboard stood bare. No rice, no oil, no grains to stretch into a meal. Only a single loaf of bread remained, hard and small, wrapped in worn cloth as if it carried the memory of better days. She touched it gently, almost reverently, knowing it was all she had left. That loaf was her survival, and perhaps her children's hope, though they had long gone to bed with empty stomachs. Tears welled in her eyes as she asked herself the question that haunted her. Would kindness still matter when survival was at stake? She remembered her late husband's words. True wealth is not in gold, but in the heart that still gives, even when it has nothing left. His voice replayed in her mind like a song meant for this very moment. She sighed deeply, wondering if those words could still guide her when her bones ached with hunger. Tomorrow, perhaps, she could find work in the fields or wash clothes for the wealthy women of the village. But tonight, there was only the bread, her last shield against despair. Little did she know, that single loaf of bread, sitting quietly on the shelf, would decide the course of her destiny. Sometimes, life interrupts despair with a sound so simple, yet so unexpected, it changes everything. For the widow, it was not the cry of her stomach that startled her that night, but the faint, trembling knock at her wooden door. She froze, the small loaf of bread clutched in her hands. Who could possibly be calling at such an hour? The village rarely saw visitors after dark, and her heart raced with both fear and curiosity. The knock came again, softer this time, as though the person behind the door lacked the strength to insist. Slowly, she set the bread aside and moved toward the sound. Her bare feet brushed against the cold floor, her mind swirling with questions. A neighbor? A beggar like me? Or trouble? Her hand lingered on the latch, trembling. She almost chose to ignore it, but a strange tug at her heart urged her to open. With a deep breath, she pulled the door slightly ajar. There, framed by the pale glow of the moon, stood a man weary, hollow-eyed, and shivering. His clothes hung loose, dirted by travel. His lips cracked as if he hadn't eaten in days. He looked at her with eyes that pleaded without words. And in that fragile silence, the widow realized the knock was not just on her door. It was on her heart. The widow had seen hunger before, but never had she seen it etched so deeply into a man's face. His eyes, hollow yet burning with silent desperation, spoke louder than any words could. They were not just eyes of a hungry man. They were the eyes of someone who had walked through storms, battled loneliness, and carried burdens heavier than his frail body could bear. One glance at him, and her heart tightened with both fear and pity. He didn't speak at first. His lips trembled as though forming words was a battle in itself. His hand clutched the frame of the door, as if standing upright demanded his last strength. When at last he managed to whisper, his voice was weak but clear enough to pierce her heart. "Please, just a bite. Anything." The widow looked over her shoulder at the single loaf resting on the shelf. It was all she had, her last shield against hunger, the final meal that stood between her and despair. Yet, when her eyes returned to the strangers, she saw more than desperation. She saw a plea for life itself. And suddenly, the choice before her was no longer simple bread, but humanity. The widow's eyes lingered on the loaf of bread resting quietly on the shelf. It was not much, just enough to silence the ache in her stomach for one night. Yet now, That small piece of bread stood between her survival and the stranger's life. One loaf, one choice, and the weight of it pressed down heavier than any burden she had carried before. She turned back to the man, his hollow face framed by the night's chill. His eyes, still pleading, mirrored the very hunger she had hidden within herself for days. If I give it away, what will become of me tomorrow? She thought, her mind warring against her heart. But then, her husband's voice echoed again, a memory etched in love. True kindness is measured not by what we give in abundance, but by what we share in sacrifice. Slowly, her trembling hands reached for the bread. She held it close for a moment, almost as if it were her last embrace with hope. Then, lifting her gaze to the man, she whispered softly, "You need this more than I do." And with that, she extended the loaf, not just giving bread, but giving all she had left. For a moment, the widow's hands hesitated as they stretched forward with the bread. Her body screamed for food, her empty stomach twisting painfully as though warning her of the mistake she was about to make. Hunger was a cruel master, one that whispered, "Keep it, you need it. Tomorrow is uncertain." The thought tempted her, pulling her heart in one direction while compassion pulled it in another. The stranger's frail figure wavered before her, his breath shallow, his eyes dimming like a flame about to go out. The widow could almost hear his silence crying louder than words. She thought of her own children, who had once known the same hunger, and a tear slipped down her cheek. Hunger was her reality, but compassion was her choice. And in that fragile moment, she realized compassion carried a power hunger could never steal. With steady resolve, she pressed the loaf into his trembling hands. "Eat," she whispered, even though her own lips were dry with longing. The man looked at her as though she had given him the world, his eyes filling with gratitude and disbelief. In that instant, hunger lost its battle to compassion, and destiny quietly took notice. The loaf looked small in the stranger's hands, yet in that moment, it felt larger than life itself. His fingers trembled as he held it, as though it were too precious for him to claim. He looked at the widow, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Are you certain? This is all you have?" She nodded, though inside her heart quivered with fear of tomorrow. She had given away her last meal, but in her spirit, she felt she had given something far greater: dignity, kindness, and faith. The man lifted the bread slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. When he took the first bite, it was not merely food that entered his body, but life itself. The widow watched him eat, her own stomach tightening painfully, yet her soul found an odd sense of peace. In giving, she felt lighter, freer, as though the burden of despair had lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel completely empty. What she didn't know was that the gift she believed so small was, in truth, the very key to unlocking a destiny she could never imagine. One act of compassion was about to rewrite her story. The man paused after swallowing the first mouthful, his eyes glistening as though the bread carried more than flavor, it carried mercy. He looked at the widow, and for a moment words failed him. Then, in a voice hoarse with exhaustion, yet heavy with meaning, he whispered, "May the one who sees in secret bless you beyond your imagination." His words were not shouted, not dramatic, but soft. A blessing spoken like a seed planted in the soil of her weary heart. The widow stood silently, uncertain how to respond. She had not given for reward, nor did she expect gratitude. To her, it had been a simple choice between clinging to her own hunger or answering another's. Yet something about his tone sent a quiet warmth through her chest, as if heaven itself had paused to listen. She nodded gently, her lips trembling, and said only, "Eat and regain your strength." The man smiled faintly and returned to the bread, savoring each bite as though it were a feast. The widow turned away, unaware that the blessing spoken softly that night would echo louder in her future than she could ever dream. As the stranger ate slowly, his hands shook with every bite. It wasn't only weakness from hunger, it was something deeper. His lips pressed tightly together, as if he was trying to keep something hidden. But his eyes betrayed him. They filled with tears that glistened in the dim light, tears he tried to blink away before they could fall. The widow noticed, though she said nothing. She simply watched, her heart tugged by the mystery of a man who carried more than hunger in his eyes. He turned his face slightly, pretending to focus on the bread, but the tears slipped down his cheeks anyway. They were not tears of shame, nor only of relief. They were tears of remembrance, of gratitude, of a man who knew the value of kindness in a world where it was rare. He swallowed hard, not just the bread but also emotions too heavy to explain. The widow, though puzzled, felt no need to question him. Sometimes silence spoke louder than words. In that quiet night, as crumbs of bread fell softly to the ground, the widow had unknowingly touched a wound far greater than hunger. And the stranger's silent tears carried secrets that would one day astonish her. By morning, the small act of kindness had already traveled beyond the widow's home. Villages, after all, carried ears sharper than walls and tongues quicker than the wind. A neighbor had seen the ragged stranger step into her house, and another had noticed him leave in the night with fuller steps than when he arrived. Soon, whispers began to stir across the dusty paths and market corners. "She gave him her last loaf," one woman said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Imagine, when she herself has nothing." Another laughed mockingly, shaking her head. "Foolishness! What kind of widow gives away her only food to a beggar? Tomorrow she will starve, and who will pity her then?" Some, however, spoke in softer tones, marveling at her courage. "It takes a heart stronger than hunger to do what she did," an elder muttered, half in awe. The widow heard fragments of these whispers as she fetched water that morning. Some words pierced her like thorns, others soothed like balm. But she walked on, her head neither bowed in shame nor lifted in pride. She had made her choice, and though the world may talk, her conscience remained at peace. The village was small, and in small places, gossip traveled faster than the wind. By midday, the widow could feel the stares on her back as she passed through the marketplace. Women fetching vegetables paused to whisper, and men sitting idly beneath the old neem tree chuckled under their breath. It wasn't long before someone dared to speak openly. "There goes the widow," one voice sneered. "She feeds beggars when she can't even feed herself." Laughter followed, harsh and cutting. Another woman joined in, her tone dripping with scorn. "Maybe she thinks bread is a magic key to blessings. Or perhaps she hopes the beggar will return with gold. Poor fool! Doesn't she know kindness doesn't fill an empty stomach?" The words echoed loudly, meant for her to hear. The widow's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. She clutched her worn shawl tighter and walked on, each mocking word pressing against her like stones. Yet beneath their laughter, a few eyes watched with quiet respect, though fear of ridicule kept them silent. The widow's act of compassion was misunderstood, twisted into weakness. But she knew the truth. Kindness is never wasted, even when the world mocks it. And soon, their laughter would choke on silence. That night, silence wrapped itself around the widow's small home, but peace did not come with it. She lay on her thin mat, staring at the cracked ceiling, her stomach twisting from hunger. The bread was gone, given away to a stranger whose face she could not forget. His hollow eyes, his trembling hands, and his whispered blessing played over and over in her mind like a song she could not silence. She turned from side to side, her heart heavy with questions. Had she done the right thing? What if tomorrow brought nothing? What if hunger finally won? Doubt clawed at her, trying to convince her that compassion had been a mistake. Yet, even as fear whispered, a strange peace lingered in her chest. She remembered the blessing spoken softly, words that had carried a weight she could not explain. It was as though the man had left more than footprints behind. He had left a spark of hope. Her eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. Tomorrow was uncertain, but tonight she held on to one truth. Sometimes, giving away your last meal was the only way to make room for a miracle. Morning came with the sound of roosters and the rustle of neighbors beginning their day. The widow rose weakly, her body still aching from hunger, and stepped outside to fetch water. She expected nothing more than another hard day of survival, but fate had other plans. As she returned to her doorstep, balancing the clay pot on her hip, she froze. Standing there, almost as though he had never left, was the stranger. His clothes were just as worn, his face still tired, but his eyes carried something different this time. He wasn't trembling, nor did he look as lost as before. Instead, there was a quiet strength about him, and a kind of determination that unsettled her. "You," she whispered, her heart racing. "Why have you come back?" The man bowed his head slightly, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "Because some debts," he said softly, "are too great to leave unpaid." His words were gentle, but they carried a weight that made the widow's hands tremble. She had given him bread, but in his gaze, she sensed he had returned with something far greater than hunger in his heart. The widow stood uncertain, her clay pot still balanced on her hip as the stranger stepped closer. His eyes, though weary, carried a piercing curiosity that made her uneasy. He did not ask for food this time. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and asked, "Why did you give me your last meal when you had nothing left for yourself?" His question hung in the air like a riddle, one that demanded more than a simple answer. She lowered the pot slowly, her lips trembling. "Because hunger may weaken the body," she whispered, "but selfishness destroys the soul. I could not let you stand at my door and die while I clung to one piece of bread." Her words surprised even her. She had not planned them, yet they flowed from a place deeper than thought, from pain, from love, from the memory of her late husband's wisdom. The stranger studied her carefully, as though her answer unlocked something within him. He asked again, his voice gentler this time, "And what do you dream of, widow, when you close your eyes at night?" The question pierced her heart. She had buried her dreams long ago, yet now, before this mysterious man, they stirred like embers waiting for flame. The stranger's question lingered in the widow's mind long after it was spoken. Dreams? The word itself felt foreign, almost foolish. She had not dared to dream in years. Hunger, loss, and hardship had stripped her of such luxuries, leaving only survival as her daily pursuit. For a moment, she lowered her eyes, afraid to speak. But the man's gaze was steady, kind, almost urging her to remember what she had buried. "I once dreamed of teaching," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling with shame and longing. "When I was a girl, I loved books more than food. I wanted to open a small school to teach children who had nothing, so they could build a future better than mine. But when my husband died, life left no space for dreams. Feeding my family became the only lesson I had left to teach." The stranger listened intently, his eyes reflecting not pity but admiration. Her words had unlocked something raw and true, a piece of her that had not died, only slept. She realized then that dreams do not vanish. They wait patiently for courage to call them back. And courage had quietly stepped into her home in the form of a stranger. The stranger's question had stirred something in the widow's heart, and as she sat in silence that evening, she found herself drawn to an old wooden box beneath her bed. Dust clung to its edges, and the hinges creaked as she opened it, revealing a small, worn notebook wrapped in faded cloth. She hadn't touched it in years. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it out, brushing away the dust as if uncovering a buried part of herself. Inside the notebook were yellowed pages filled with handwriting, her own, written in a younger, more hopeful time. Lesson plans, children's names she once dreamed of teaching, and even sketches of a tiny schoolhouse filled the pages. She turned each one slowly, her heart tightening with both pain and nostalgia. These were the dreams she had hidden, tucked away with the belief that life had no space for them anymore. The stranger, who had been watching quietly, leaned closer. "You kept them," he said softly, as if reading her soul. The widow looked at him with misty eyes. "I thought they were nothing but forgotten ink," she replied. He shook his head gently. "No dream written with such love is ever truly forgotten." His words struck her like a spark, reigniting something long thought dead. The widow sat on her small wooden stool, notebook resting in her lap, pages spread open like fragile wings of a bird that had long been caged. She expected the stranger to glance briefly and lose interest, the way others in the village always did when she spoke of books or learning. But instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on her as though her words were treasures he dared not miss. She began hesitantly, pointing to a sketch she had drawn years ago of a tiny classroom with benches made from planks of wood. "I thought, perhaps, children who cannot afford the city schools might learn here, even if all they had was chalk and a board." Her voice shook, but she kept speaking, flipping through pages filled with lessons on letters and numbers. The stranger nodded at every word, asking questions that showed he was not just hearing her but truly listening. No one had ever listened this way. Not her neighbors who mocked her dreams. Not even herself who had silenced her own voice. For the first time in years, the widow felt her heart lift. And she wondered, who exactly was this man, who listened as though her dreams mattered? Night fell quietly, the moon casting pale light through the cracks in the widow's walls. The stranger still sat with her, the notebook between them, its pages whispering of forgotten dreams. For a long while neither spoke. Then, in the hush of the evening, the man's voice broke the silence. "Widow," he said softly, "your kindness will not be forgotten. I will see to it." His words, though spoken gently, carried a weight that made her chest tighten. She looked at him, puzzled, almost uneasy. "You owe me nothing," she said firmly, shaking her head. "I gave what I had because it was right, not because I wanted something in return." But the man's eyes glimmered in the half-light, and a faint smile curved his lips. "Still," he replied, "a gift given in sacrifice deserves a return in destiny." His tone was not boastful, not even promising in the way of men who often make empty vows. It felt different, certain, as though he already knew what lay ahead. The widow did not fully understand, but his words lingered in her heart as shadows deepened around them. Somewhere in the stillness of that night, a promise was made, one that would soon unfold in ways she could not imagine. The next morning, the widow rose early, expecting to find her guest gone like a passing shadow. But when she opened her door, she froze. Parked just beyond her humble gate was something she had never seen so close before. A sleek, black car shining in the morning sun. Its polished surface looked foreign against the dusty road of her village, and the sight of it made her heart pound with unease. The stranger stood nearby, no longer looking like the helpless beggar she had first met. Though his clothes were still simple, there was a quiet authority in the way he carried himself. A man in a crisp suit stood beside the car, his posture straight, his eyes sharp as if waiting for instructions. The widow clutched her shawl tighter, confusion racing through her mind. Why would a man like this travel with such a vehicle? Who exactly had she invited into her home? The stranger turned to her and spoke calmly, almost as though he had expected her fear. "Do not be afraid. That car is here for you." His words felt unreal, impossible. She stared at him in disbelief, her breath catching. For the first time, she realized, her simple act of kindness had opened a door far bigger than her small home. The widow's feet felt heavy, rooted to the ground as she stared at the car gleaming before her. Never in her life had she been this close to something that seemed to belong in another world. a world of wealth, power, and people far removed from her struggles. Her heart raced. Every instinct screamed to retreat back into her small, familiar home, where the cracked walls and worn floor offered at least the comfort of knowing what to expect. The stranger extended his hand gently, his voice calm yet firm. "Trust me," he said. "One step is all it takes." His eyes held no mockery, only quiet assurance, as if he had already seen the path laid out before her. The widow hesitated, clutching her shawl tightly around her thin frame. Fear wrestled with curiosity, doubt battled against hope. Finally, with a trembling breath, she lifted her foot and placed it forward. Then another. Each step felt like walking away from her past and into an unknown future. When she reached the car, she paused, her reflection staring back at her in the glossy surface. A widow, worn and weary, yet carrying something greater than fear, courage. And with that reluctant step, her journey into destiny truly began. The car rumbled to life, its smooth hum unlike anything the widow had ever heard. She sat stiffly in the back seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap as the world outside her window began to change. The familiar dirt roads of her village gave way to wide, paved streets. Huts faded into tall buildings, and bustling crowds replaced the quiet faces she had always known. For the first time, she saw the city. Not from a distance, not through stories, but with her own eyes. Her gaze darted from one sight to another. Bright lights that refused to bow to the sun, shops filled with goods she had never imagined, and children dressed in fine clothes laughing freely on their way to schools larger than her entire village. It was overwhelming, almost frightening, as though she had stepped into a different world altogether. The widow pressed her hand against the window, her heart pounding. How could one small act of kindness bring me here? She wondered. Beside her, the stranger watched her silently, his expression unreadable. But deep in his eyes was a knowing look, as though every turn of the road was part of a journey he had planned long before she understood it. The car slowed as it approached a towering structure that seemed to pierce the sky itself. The widow's eyes widened. Never had she seen walls of glass gleam so brightly under the sun, reflecting the world around them like a giant mirror. At the entrance stood guards in sharp uniforms, their posture straight and commanding, as though every breath they took was measured. The widow's heart skipped. This was no ordinary place. The stranger stepped out first, extending his hand to her once more. "Do not be afraid," he said gently. She followed, her feet unsteady as they touched the polished stone steps. The massive doors before her opened without anyone pushing them, as though even the wind obeyed unseen commands here. Inside, chandeliers glittered like captured stars, and the floors shone so brightly she could see her own reflection. A tired woman in a faded shawl, standing where she did not belong. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Why am I here?" The stranger's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Because sometimes," he answered, "those who give the least they have are worthy of the most." His words filled her with both fear and wonder as the building swallowed her whole. The widow stepped cautiously into the grand hallway, her footsteps echoing faintly against the polished marble. Towering doors lined the corridor, each carved with intricate patterns she could not begin to understand. They stood tall, heavy, and majestic, as though they guarded secrets too valuable to be seen by just anyone. Her hand brushed lightly over one of the handles, but the stranger shook his head gently. "These are not ordinary doors," he explained. "Each one opens only once, and only for the person it is meant for." His words sent a shiver down her spine. The widow looked again at the imposing doors, realizing they were not just wood and metal but thresholds into choices, opportunities, perhaps even destinies. Once crossed, there would be no turning back. Her breath caught as they stopped before one particularly large door, its carvings more detailed than the rest, vines wrapping around symbols she did not recognize. The stranger's gaze softened as he turned to her. "This door," he whispered. Was waiting for you long before you knew it existed. She stared at it, fear and wonder twisting inside her chest. Could she dare to step through a door that might change her life forever? When the great door creaked open, the widow gasped. Before her stretched a hall like nothing she had ever imagined. Long tables covered with silver dishes, golden platters piled high with fruits, meats, bread, and desserts she had only heard about in stories. The aroma filled the air so richly it made her knees weak. For a woman who had gone to bed hungry more nights than she could count, the sight was almost too much to bear. Her hands trembled as she stepped closer, afraid it was all a cruel illusion. The stranger's voice broke the silence. This feast was prepared not for the wealthy, but for the weary. It is yours. Tears pricked her eyes as she remembered her empty cupboard back home, the single loaf she had surrendered without hesitation. Now before her was more food than her village could eat in a month. Still, she hesitated. How can someone like me sit at a table like this? She thought. The stranger gently pulled out a chair. Compassion has fed you more than once, he said softly. Now it is time for you to be fed. With trembling resolve, the widow took her seat at the feast prepared for the hungry heart. As the widow sat at the long, glittering table, she became aware of more than the food. Around the hall, dozens of figures in sharp suits and elegant attire observed her quietly, their eyes attentive, almost calculating. These were faces of power, people whose decisions could move cities, build fortunes, or crush dreams. For a moment, the widow felt small, insignificant, an ordinary woman in a world that demanded extraordinary credentials. Yet the stranger's presence beside her was steady, anchoring her fear. He whispered softly, "Do not be intimidated. They are watching not to judge, but to understand what courage looks like." Slowly, she lifted her gaze to meet the curious eyes around her. Some were skeptical, some intrigued, others plainly astonished at the simplicity of a woman who had offered her last meal without hesitation. Their whispers were hushed, but she could sense the silent conversation. Who is she? Why is she here? In that moment, the widow realized that power was not always in wealth or status. True influence could be found in acts of kindness, bravery, and honesty. And as the strangers watched, she felt a quiet pride rise within her, a recognition that her choices had begun to ripple far beyond her humble village. The hall grew still as the stranger stepped aside, gesturing toward the widow. She hesitated, her fingers clutching the edge of her chair, the grandeur of the room pressing on her chest. Then, taking a deep breath, she stood. Her voice, though soft at first, carried steadily through the hall. "I am no one of wealth or influence," she began, her eyes scanning the faces of the powerful. "I am a widow, a woman who had nothing but a single loaf of bread." She recounted the story. The empty cupboard, the knock at her door, the stranger's hollow eyes, and the choice she made to give away her last meal. Each word hung in the air, heavy with honesty and humility. The room was silent, the kind of silence that presses into your soul, making every person present feel the weight of her courage. When she finished, she looked around, uncertain of the reaction. Then came nods, small smiles, and a quiet murmur of approval. The widow realized that truth, courage, and compassion were more powerful than titles or wealth. Her testimony had bridged worlds, from a small, hungry village to the eyes of those who held influence over millions. The widow's words lingered in the grand hall long after she had spoken. Though she had only shared a simple act of kindness, the truth in her voice seemed to ripple outward, touching each listener in ways she could not have imagined. The powerful figures around her were silent, some leaning forward, others exchanging glances, as if the honesty in her story bypassed all hierarchy, wealth, and titles. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of integrity, humility, and sacrifice, qualities the room had rarely encountered so plainly. She continued to speak, recounting not just her choice to give the last loaf of bread, but the inner struggle that had preceded it, the fear, the hunger, and the uncertainty of survival. Every detail, every tremor in her voice, resonated with those who listened. The stranger watched quietly, his gaze unwavering, knowing that the impact of this moment would extend far beyond the room. By the time she finished, the hall was transformed from a room of onlookers into a chamber of reflection. Her voice had done more than tell a story. It had echoed truth in a place where truth was rare, leaving an imprint that could not be erased. The widow had spoken, and the hall had fallen silent, but the stranger remained close, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he removed the hood that had concealed him since the night he first appeared at her door. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a weight that made the widow's breath catch in her throat. Beneath the shadows and dirt of his previous appearance stood a man of striking presence, not just in appearance, but in the authority that radiated from him. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some faces paled, others widened in disbelief. The widow's heart raced. This was not merely a man who had accepted bread from a widow. This was someone whose name carried weight across cities, whose fortune could move mountains and change lives with a signature. Her eyes met his, and in that gaze, she found no arrogance, only quiet gratitude and a deep respect. "You were kind without knowing who I was," he said softly, his voice steady, calm, almost reverent. "And that," he continued, "reveals a heart far richer than any treasure I possess." The widow's breath caught, realizing that her act of compassion had touched someone far greater than she had ever imagined. The hall buzzed quietly, a mixture of awe and disbelief filling the air. The widow's eyes remained fixed on the man before her, the stranger who had first arrived at her door in tattered clothes. Now, standing tall, with the hood removed, the truth shone clearly. He was a billionaire, a man whose wealth and influence spanned countries. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile the hungry, desperate figure she had fed with the powerful presence now before her. The stranger smiled gently, noticing her bewilderment. "I test people in ways few can understand," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Most measure kindness against fame or fortune. You measured it against need, against humanity itself." The room held its collective breath. The widow swallowed hard, realizing that her simple act of giving her last meal had transcended mere charity. She had been chosen not for status, for looks, or for skill, but for the purity of her heart. The billionaire extended his hand, not in formality, but in recognition. "Because of your courage and compassion, I want to offer you more than gratitude. I want to offer you a chance to rebuild your dreams." The widow's heart pounded. Destiny had arrived, not with a fanfare, but with the quiet power of a truth she had never sought. The billionaire's words hung in the air, and for a moment, the hall was utterly still. Then came the first gasp, sharp, involuntary, followed by another, and then a ripple of disbelief that spread across the room. Faces that had been composed moments ago were now painted with astonishment. Some whispered under their breath, others stared openly, unable to hide the shock. The widow herself felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes wide as she tried to grasp the reality of the moment. Many in the room had assumed wealth brought arrogance, manipulation, or cruelty. Yet here stood a man whose very presence had begun with humility, whose identity had been hidden behind need, and whose recognition now rested on the widow's compassion. Even the most powerful figures in the room shifted uneasily, realizing they had underestimated the strength of a simple act of kindness. The widow's gaze met the billionaire's. His eyes held neither condescension nor expectation, only quiet acknowledgement. In that gaze, she realized the room's gasps were not just about him, they were about her. Her choice to give away her last loaf had spoken louder than gold, louder than power, louder than every whisper of doubt she had ever heard. The billionaire's voice broke the tense silence, gentle yet resonant. "Tell me," he said, leaning forward slightly, Why did you share your last meal with a stranger? When hunger clawed at your own stomach, why did you choose to give? The question hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, like a challenge wrapped in kindness. All eyes turned toward the widow, but it was his gaze that held her attention, steady and probing. Her hands shook slightly as she lowered her eyes, recalling the night of the knock, the hollow eyes of a man who had nothing. I didn't think of reward, she whispered, her voice catching. I only saw someone in need. I saw a person, not a beggar, not a stranger, and I couldn't turn away. I had little, but it was all I could give. Felt, right? Her words, simple and raw, seemed to ripple through the hall. The billionaire's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. And that, widow, he said softly, is why you were chosen, because true generosity is measured not by wealth, but by the heart. Yours is extraordinary. The room remained silent, the weight of her answer echoing in every mind present. The widow took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly before her. She met the billionaire's eyes and spoke simply, honestly, without hesitation. I gave what little I had because it was the right thing to do, she said softly. I could not see a person suffer and do nothing. That is all there is to it. Her words carried the weight of truth, and though humble, they resonated in the silent hall with remarkable force. The powerful figures around her shifted uneasily, some nodding in quiet admiration, others struck by the profound simplicity of her response. In a world accustomed to complex motives and hidden agendas, her honesty was like a breath of fresh air. The billionaire's gaze softened, and a faint smile touched his lips. Exactly, he said. It is always the simplest acts of courage and kindness that reveal the true measure of a person. The widow's heart swelled, not with pride, but with a quiet, steady confidence she had not felt in years. Her choice, her compassion, and her integrity had spoken louder than wealth or power ever could. In that moment, she realized that sometimes the simplest answer carries the deepest impact. After the widow spoke, a silence fell over the grand hall, heavy and profound, the kind of silence that fills every corner of a room, leaving hearts and minds straining to grasp its weight. The powerful figures seated around the glittering tables exchanged glances, some with awe, others with disbelief. It was not the wealth or the status of the billionaire that held them in quiet amazement, but the courage and integrity of a simple widow who had given her last meal without hesitation. The stranger, now revealed as the billionaire, looked at her with steady, approving eyes. See, he whispered, this is why your actions echo beyond your village. His words seemed to amplify the stillness, making the truth settle into every mind present. Even the most skeptical faces could not hide the realization. Generosity, courage, and compassion had the power to silence the loudest voices of doubt. The widow's chest rose and fell steadily, her heart calm despite the weight of attention. She had not sought recognition, yet her choices had drawn all eyes upon her. The hall remained silent, stunned, reverent, a testament to the quiet power of a kind and courageous heart. The billionaire's voice cut through the stunned silence, calm yet commanding. I am not here to reward you with wealth alone, he began, his eyes fixed on the widow. What I offer goes beyond money. It is a chance to rebuild your life, your dreams, and your dignity, to restore the hope that life tried to steal from you. The words fell gently, yet with weight that pressed deep into her heart. The widow blinked, her mind racing. She had imagined riches, a comfortable life perhaps, but never an offer that spoke to the soul. For years, she had believed that survival was all life had left to give. Yet here was someone offering her not only comfort, but a chance to reclaim the life she had quietly mourned. Her chest tightened, part disbelief, part hope. The billionaire continued, You have given without expecting. You have acted with courage and compassion. That is why I am giving you this opportunity, not as charity, but as recognition of the extraordinary person you already are. The widow's heart fluttered, realizing that destiny was arriving in a form far more profound than coins or gold. The widow stood in the center of the grand office, clutching the worn notebook that had once held her forgotten dreams. The billionaire's words echoed in her mind. A chance to rebuild, to reclaim hope, to give life to what had been buried under years of hardship. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that her dream, the dream of teaching, of guiding children who had nothing, could rise from the ashes of her past. She walked slowly, her fingers tracing the pages filled with lessons she had drafted so long ago. Each sketch of a schoolroom, each lesson plan, now felt alive, pulsating with possibility. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sorrow, but from a deep, overwhelming joy. The billionaire watched quietly, his presence a silent affirmation that her courage had led her to this moment. The widow realized that giving her last meal, standing firm in kindness, and facing the whispers of her village had been the first steps toward this restoration. Dreams, she understood now, were never truly lost. They were waiting for moments of courage, for acts of compassion, for opportunities that recognized the value of a good heart. The widow stepped onto the hilltop, her heart swelling as she gazed at the small, newly built schoolhouse before her. The walls were fresh and bright, the windows gleaming in the sunlight, and a gentle wind carried the scent of paint and new beginnings. She had once dreamed of teaching children in a modest room with cracked walls and dusty floors. Now, that dream had taken form on this hill, built with care and a vision that surpassed even her imagination. Children ran across the courtyard, their laughter ringing like music, bright and unburdened. Some had never seen a school this beautiful, and their eyes widened in wonder. The widow's chest tightened as she realized that her gift of compassion, given so long ago to a starving stranger, had indirectly created this place of learning. Each child represented a life touched by courage, kindness, and hope, values she had upheld even in her darkest hours. Standing at the threshold, she opened the door and stepped inside, the sunlight illuminating the rows of desks. This school was more than bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of restored dreams, a legacy born from a simple act of generosity. The widow stood in the school's empty hall, sunlight streaming through the windows, painting the room with warmth. She ran her fingers along the polished desks, imagining the eager children who would soon sit here, hungry not for bread, but for knowledge. For years, life had stripped her of pride, leaving only survival and uncertainty. Yet now, standing in the realization of her dream brought to life, she felt a dignity that no hunger or hardship could ever take away. It was more than just a building. It was a testament to the power of integrity, kindness, and resilience. Her act of giving, a single loaf of bread, had cascaded into something far greater, restoring her own sense of purpose and self-worth. Every lesson she would teach, every child she would inspire, carried her legacy forward. The billionaire watched quietly from the doorway, offering only a faint smile, knowing he had merely guided destiny to its rightful path. The widow exhaled, letting the weight of her past struggles dissolve. In that moment, she understood that dignity is not granted by wealth or status, but reclaimed through courage, compassion, and unwavering faith in what is right. Word of the widow's school spread quickly through her village, carried on excited whispers and curious glances. Children ran home, chattering about desks, books, and teachers they had only dreamed of before. Parents gathered at the gates, eyes wide with disbelief and hearts brimming with hope. The village that had once known hunger, despair, and skepticism now pulsed with the possibility of a brighter future. The widow's single act of generosity had created ripples far beyond her humble home. Roads were repaired, water wells were cleaned, and even the crumbling marketplace gained new life as villagers were inspired to act for themselves and their neighbors. Her neighbors, once quick to mock and gossip, now approached her with admiration and curiosity, eager to learn how kindness and courage could reshape a community. The widow realized that the power to transform did not lie in wealth alone, but in acts of heart that spark change and inspire others to follow. From her window, she watched the village awaken in ways she had never imagined. Children laughed, elders spoke with renewed vigor, and the air itself seemed lighter. The widow understood that destiny had a way of rewarding those who gave without expectation, turning even the smallest gestures into legacies that could change lives forever. Years passed, and the widow's school became more than just a place of learning. It grew into a symbol of hope and resilience. Children who once scavenged for scraps now sat in orderly rows, their eyes bright with curiosity and dreams. The village itself thrived, nourished not only by education but by the spirit of generosity that had ignited in one woman's heart. Her simple act, giving away her last meal, had created a legacy that would endure far longer than she ever imagined. She walked through the hallways, touching the walls, watching students recite lessons, and listening to laughter that felt like music after years of silence. Each face reflected a life transformed, a cycle of kindness and opportunity extended beyond herself. Visitors came from distant towns, inspired by the story of the widow who had dared to act with compassion despite her own hardships. The billionaire, who had first recognized her courage, remained a quiet supporter, ensuring her vision flourished while leaving the heart of the legacy untouched, hers alone. In the twilight of her years, the widow smiled, knowing that dignity, courage, and compassion had conquered despair. She had not only survived, she had changed the course of many lives, leaving behind a legacy that spoke louder than wealth ever could. The widow had long known the man who appeared at her door was no ordinary stranger, but the full truth of his mission had remained hidden until now. One afternoon, as she walked through the bustling schoolyard, he called her aside, his eyes serious but gentle. "There is something you must know," he began. "The journey that brought me to your door was not by chance. I search for people whose hearts are unshakable, whose kindness does not depend on reward. That is my mission, to find those rare souls and ensure their actions create ripples far beyond what they imagine." Her heart skipped. All this time, she had thought she was simply offering a loaf of bread out of necessity and compassion, yet she had unknowingly become part of a plan far greater than herself. The billionaire continued, "I test the world's conscience, and those who respond without hesitation become catalysts for change. You, widow, became the spark that transformed not only your life but countless others." The widow stood in silence, awe mingling with humility. The man she had fed in desperation had been carrying a purpose, one that aligned perfectly with her own courage. Their meeting, seemingly coincidental, had always been destiny in disguise. The widow stood on the hilltop, overlooking the school and the thriving village below. Memories of the night she gave her last loaf of bread returned vividly. The hunger in her own belly, the desperate eyes at her door, the quiet decision to act without expectation. That single loaf, simple and unassuming, had become the seed of a legacy far greater than she had ever imagined. Every child learning to read, every life touched by her courage, every parent inspired to give, all were part of the chain that began with one act of kindness. The billionaire stood beside her, his presence steady but unobtrusive. "You see," he said softly, "this is what happens when a heart acts without hesitation. Wealth can build walls, but kindness builds bridges. You have crossed that bridge, and in doing so, you have changed more lives than you could ever count." The widow felt tears rise, not from sorrow but from the overwhelming realization that her small act had reshaped destiny. She had started with nothing, yet ended with a legacy of hope, courage, and dignity, a testament that even the humblest offering, given freely, can echo across time. And so, from a simple loaf of bread, a widow's heart transformed a world. Thank you for watching through. Hey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And while you're at it, smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single update.